Behind palace walls, a storm was brewing. When Princess Anne broke down in tears after shielding Prince George from Camilla's quiet power move, the royal facade cracked. Was this a protective act, or the start of a royal war? And how did Anne, the unshakable pillar of duty, become the protector of a future king? The truth shakes the crown to its core. Camilla's rise and Princess Anne's reservations. When Camilla Parker Bowles officially entered the royal family in 2005 by marrying Charles, she stepped into a storm of lingering public resentment and private royal skepticism. For years, she had been portrayed in the media as the other woman in the tragic saga of Princess Diana and Prince Charles. Despite Queen Elizabeth II's eventual approval of the union, not everyone within the family embraced Camilla's arrival with open arms. And among those least convinced of her rightful place was Princess Anne. Princess Anne, known for her stoicism, hard work, and deep loyalty to her mother's legacy, had always believed in the importance of royal duty and discipline over personal preference. She had lived through decades of strict protocol and represented the monarchy with unwavering composure. To her, Camilla's controversial past and late integration into the firm didn't easily align with what she saw as royal propriety. This wasn't about personal dislike, it was about protecting the crown from reputational risk. Body language experts and royal watchers often pointed to Anne's subtle cues during public events. She rarely made eye contact with Camilla, and often stood apart during family gatherings, keeping conversations short. At official events, Anne remained cordial, but observers noticed the cool formality in her posture. Behind palace doors, whispers suggested that Anne had expressed doubt about Camilla's future role and whether she should be anything more than a supporting figure to Charles. Anne wasn't the only one who held reservations, but she had the courage and perhaps the authority to show it. As the second child and only daughter of the Queen, Anne had always carried herself with a sense of earned seniority. She wasn't one for theatrics or headlines, but she had a way of making her point known with minimal fuss. When the family gathered behind closed doors after Camilla's marriage, it was Anne who reportedly spoke up first to question the wisdom of elevating Camilla's public profile too quickly. This silent power dynamic continued through the years. While Camilla gradually won over much of the public and press, Anne remained a symbol of traditional values within the family. Her approach was simple: earn your place, maintain dignity, and avoid scandal. To her, Camilla's history was not easily erased, no matter how charming or helpful she became. Tensions heightened when Queen Elizabeth's health began to decline. With Charles poised to take the throne, conversations about titles and future roles stirred old wounds. Anne, who had remained loyal to royal traditions for decades, feared that the line between duty and personal preference was becoming blurred. She reportedly warned close aides that the monarchy must not be reshaped to soothe reputations or rewrite history. The first open crack in the relationship between Anne and Camilla became visible in the months leading up to Charles's coronation. Reports of icy exchanges and firm corrections surfaced, hinting that Anne's long-held reservations were beginning to harden. Still, she remained silent in public, holding on to the stoicism that had earned her respect over the years. But behind her quiet resistance was a growing concern, not just for tradition, but for the younger royals who would inherit the consequences of today's decisions. She had always kept a watchful eye on her nephews and nieces, and more recently, on the children of William and Kate. As Camilla's influence grew, Anne feared that the very fabric of the monarchy could be compromised by unchecked ambition and revisionist narratives. What Anne didn't realize was that her silent unease would soon be forced into the open by an explosive moment, one that would put her face to face with the one woman she had kept at a distance for 2 decades. It wasn't about Charles anymore. It was about a child who represented the future, and a plot that no one saw coming. Because just before the coronation, everything would erupt in one shocking moment. And it would all begin with a title Anne refused to let go of. Now let's step inside the coronation dinner, where Princess Anne's quiet resistance would boil over into a confrontation that stunned even King Charles. The coronation clash. The grandeur of King Charles III's coronation loomed over the royal household like a tidal wave, while the public saw polished rehearsals, glittering robes, and smiling faces. Tension was quietly building behind the palace walls. For months, there had been subtle disagreements and strategic reshuffling, but nothing compared to the sharp exchange that erupted at a private family dinner held days before the historic ceremony. This wasn't just a disagreement about protocol, it was a challenge to Camilla's growing role, and the person who drew the line was none other than Princess Anne. Camilla, emboldened by years of increasing public favor and the king's unwavering support, had begun referring to herself simply as Queen in private circles. For most people, this may have seemed like a natural evolution, but within royal tradition, every word holds weight. The official title granted by Queen Elizabeth II before her passing was Queen Consort, a subtle but crucial distinction. It was meant to honor Camilla's position without equating her to a reigning monarch or overshadowing the late queen. At the family gathering, the tension had been simmering beneath the surface until it snapped with one comment. Camilla had reportedly made a light-hearted reference to her place as Queen Camilla, a term that, while widely accepted by the media, still struck a nerve with Anne. With the room full of senior royals, staff, and even younger members of the family, Anne responded in a voice low but unmistakably firm. She corrected Camilla mid-conversation, reminding her that she was not the queen but the queen consort. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations fell silent. Even King Charles appeared taken aback. No one had expected Anne to say it aloud, especially not in such a direct manner. But to Anne, there was no other choice. Letting that title pass unchallenged would mean abandoning the carefully preserved traditions that had guided the monarchy for centuries. Anne's objection wasn't about hierarchy or personal bitterness. It was about clarity and respect for the institution. Camilla had never been in line to rule, nor had she been groomed for it. Her place was beside the king, not on equal footing. Anne had spent her life defending protocol, and this was one line she refused to see blurred. Following the tense exchange, Camilla reportedly left the room early. Charles attempted to smooth over the moment, but the message had been delivered. Anne's correction was not just personal, it was symbolic. It signaled that not everyone within the royal family was willing to accept changes for the sake of appearance or ease. For Anne, titles were not merely ceremonial. They carried legacies, responsibilities, and the weight of history. The following days were marked by awkward silences and strategic distancing. Camilla was notably absent from some informal gatherings, while Anne kept her schedule full with royal engagements. Behind the scenes, aides attempted to minimize the fallout, briefing the press carefully and adjusting public messaging. Still, the ripple effects were undeniable. The public would never know the full story, but within the palace, lines had been drawn. What few realized was that this confrontation was only the beginning. Anne's discomfort was no longer hidden, and it would soon turn into direct action. Because even as the coronation approached, whispers of decisions being made about the younger royals, especially Prince George, began to reach her ears. Decisions that could affect the very future of the monarchy. Anne had already spoken up once, but next she would be forced to step in. And as plans unfolded behind closed doors to elevate Prince George in ways Anne never expected, she realized silence was no longer an option. The next move would change everything. royal roles and power balances. As the royal spotlight intensified in the wake of the coronation, something unusual was happening within the palace. With King Charles navigating new duties and Catherine recovering from surgery, the traditional balance of power was shifting. It wasn't just about public engagements or titles anymore. It was about who truly held influence behind the scenes. In that space, between ceremony and reality, two women quietly began representing opposing visions of what the monarchy should be: Princess Anne and Queen Camilla. Princess Anne, always the workhorse of the family, had long been admired for her sense of discipline and tireless dedication. She never asked for attention. She simply showed up, day after day, performing hundreds of royal engagements each year without fuss or fanfare. To many inside the palace, she was the glue that kept the institution grounded, especially when scandal or uncertainty shook the crown. In contrast, Camilla had grown from a once controversial figure into a more confident public presence. Supported by Charles, she gradually stepped into a senior role, overseeing charities, leading public appearances, and taking on symbolic duties. She had learned to smile through criticism and walk the tightrope of public opinion. And yet, for some members of the royal family, that rise felt forced and fast-tracked. What began as mutual distance between Anne and Camilla soon became a quiet contest over values. Anne represented continuity, the legacy of Queen Elizabeth, and the idea that personal feelings should never dictate royal decisions. Camilla represented adaptation, the need to modernize, and perhaps the belief that even a once divisive figure could be fully embraced by the crown. Inside palace meetings, Anne grew increasingly concerned about the tone of discussions. There was a noticeable push to modernize the image of the monarchy. Less formal language, more relaxed protocols, and above all, a reimagining of royal roles for the younger generation. But to Anne, that reimagining had limits. One of them was the pace at which Camilla's presence was being normalized as queen, not just in media headlines, but in royal communications. Even more troubling was a quiet undercurrent she began noticing. Conversations that hinted at changes in how the younger royals would be presented. Prince George, the future king, had always been protected from excess exposure. But Anne began hearing whispers that Camilla had voiced opinions about fast-tracking George into more public engagements. He was just a child, yet his name was being discussed in rooms he didn't belong in. Anne had always been protective of her family, especially the children. She knew the pressures of growing up in the public eye and had taken care to shield her own children from it when possible. The idea that George might be pushed forward to serve a political or image-driven purpose struck her deeply. It felt like something that had less to do with his readiness and more to do with someone else's ambition. The tension between Anne and Camilla grew colder. They no longer exchanged even brief pleasantries at private gatherings. Staff members noticed that Anne began keeping detailed notes during meetings involving the younger royals. She asked more questions, requested updates, and insisted on protocols that had been quietly slipping. To some observers, this was just Anne being Anne, dutiful, firm, and no nonsense. But to those paying closer attention, it was clear that Anne was preparing for something. She had spent her entire life staying just outside the center of power. Now she was inching closer, not for personal gain, but to protect the institution she had always served. The real breaking point hadn't come yet, but when it did, it wouldn't be about Camilla or titles or old rivalries. It would be about Prince George, and a decision that would force Anne to act in a way no one had expected. Next comes the moment that shattered royal calm. A quiet plan around Prince George that nearly went unnoticed, until Princess Anne stepped in and rewrote the script. It began as a simple agenda item during a routine planning meeting, A proposal had been floated suggesting Prince George could represent the monarchy at a youth summit in Europe. At first glance, it seemed innocent enough. After all, he was the future king, and the idea of gradually introducing him to international engagements had been discussed before. But something about the timing and urgency of this particular move didn't sit right with Princess Anne. Anne had long believed that royal children should be allowed to grow up with as much normalcy as possible. She had protected her own children fiercely from public life, ensuring they had space to shape their identities away from flashing cameras and judgmental headlines. When it came to Prince George, she felt an even greater responsibility. He wasn't just a boy, he was a symbol of the monarchy's future. Any misstep in his upbringing could ripple across generations. What concerned Anne most wasn't the proposal itself, but the source. The idea hadn't come from William and Kate, who were known for being cautious and deliberate in how they introduced their children to public duties. Instead, whispers pointed to a conversation involving Camilla and a senior advisor who had previously worked in public relations. There was talk of increasing George's visibility to strengthen the family's connection with younger audiences and create positive momentum for the new reign. Words like brand and legacy building were being used, not behind closed doors at corporate strategy meetings, but within the palace. For Anne, it was a red flag. The monarchy wasn't a brand to be molded through marketing tricks. It was a living institution with responsibilities rooted in history. Pushing George forward prematurely could not only overwhelm him, but also damage the carefully built trust between the monarchy and the public. She had seen what happened when young royals were used as shields for internal unrest or image control. It rarely ended well. She began asking questions. Who had authorized the planning of this event? Were William and Kate fully informed? Why were public relations personnel suddenly involved in matters concerning a child's education and well-being? As she dug deeper, more troubling patterns emerged. Discussions had taken place without the Prince and Princess of Wales being present. Media strategies had been drafted that included young George's name and image without direct parental consent. Even worse, there were rumors of scheduled press interactions that had not yet been approved. Anne took immediate action. She reached out to William privately, voicing her concerns with calm but unmistakable urgency. William, blindsided, confirmed that neither he nor Kate had approved the plan. In fact, they had explicitly asked for a quieter year for their children, following Kate's health issues. It was clear now that something was happening outside of normal protocols, and it had already reached dangerous territory. That night, Anne convened a quiet meeting with her closest advisors and wrote a formal objection to the event, requesting it be removed from the calendar. She presented her findings directly to King Charles, who appeared surprised by the depth of the planning. Although he tried to defuse the situation with vague reassurances, Anne did not back down. Her message was firm. Prince George would not be used as a pawn for image control. Any such moves made without parental involvement were not only inappropriate, they were unacceptable. Camilla, upon learning of Anne's intervention, reportedly responded with disbelief. She insisted she had only been part of a casual conversation and had no intention of influencing George's role. But Anne had already seen too much. Intentional or not, the momentum behind the plan had been building quietly and needed to be stopped. For the first time in years, Anne felt the weight of her position not just as a royal, but as a protector. She hadn't raised the alarm for herself or out of pride. She had done it for the boy who reminded her so much of William at that age. Kind-eyed, intelligent, and unaware of how powerful people can twist the idea of duty. This was the moment everything changed. Anne's quiet watchfulness had turned into decisive action, but the emotional toll of what she had discovered and what she had to do next would leave a deeper mark than anyone anticipated. What happened after shook even the strongest among them. As Anne faced the emotional storm she had been holding back for years, and finally broke down in a way no one expected. In the days following her intervention, Princess Anne kept her public schedule intact, as if nothing had happened. She attended charity events, shook hands with dignitaries, and wore the same unreadable expression that had defined her for decades. But beneath the surface, something inside her had begun to unravel. For a woman known for her unshakable composure, what she had confronted left a bruise she couldn't ignore. Anne had always carried herself like a soldier, disciplined, restrained, immune to drama. Even during times of family crisis, she never wavered. But this time, it wasn't just royal politics or tradition on the line. It was a child, someone innocent and vulnerable, being pulled into a world he wasn't yet equipped to navigate. The moment Anne realized how close George had come to being used in a political tug-of-war, something cracked in her. It wasn't only about George. The situation reminded her of William and Harry during their childhood, pushed into the spotlight far too early. She had watched them navigate press harassment, family tension, and the chaos that followed their mother's death. Anne had stood by, powerless then, and perhaps carried guilt for not doing more. Now, history threatened to repeat itself. This time, she had acted, but the emotional weight of what she'd uncovered stayed with her. The breaking point came quietly during a meeting with a longtime advisor. Anne sat in her private sitting room at Gatcombe Park, the silence heavy around her. The advisor asked a simple question: how she was holding up, and for once, Anne didn't respond with her usual curt nod or tired smile. Instead, she lowered her head, paused, and said nothing. A long silence followed. Then, without warning, her shoulders trembled slightly. Her hands, always steady, tightened into fists. And then, slowly, tears began to roll down her cheeks. It wasn't a sob or a loud cry. It was the kind of release that happens when someone has held too much for too long. Anne didn't cry often. In fact, very few within the palace had ever seen her so much as flinch emotionally. But that afternoon, she let herself feel everything she had been holding back. The pressure, the frustration, the isolation that came from being the one who always stepped in when no one else would. Her advisor remained silent, understanding the rarity of the moment. Anne wiped her face, took a deep breath, and regained her composure. But the vulnerability she had shown in those few minutes revealed something profound. It wasn't weakness, it was love. Love for her family, for the institution she had served her entire life, and most of all, for the generations to come. Later that evening, she called William again, not to discuss logistics or protocol, but simply to reassure him that she would always stand guard for his children, the way she wished someone had done for him. William, moved by her words, expressed something rarely shared between senior royals: gratitude. He told her George was lucky to have her. Anne hung up the phone and stood by the window, looking out at the fields stretching across the estate. For once, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. She had done what needed to be done, but the storm wasn't over. She knew the confrontation with Camilla had left scars, and that tension inside the palace was far from resolved. What she didn't know was that the public would soon get wind of what had happened. A leaked email, an overheard conversation, and suddenly, headlines would begin to swirl. The quiet drama Anne tried to contain was about to break into the open. And as whispers inside the palace turned into national headlines, the world would finally glimpse the fallout that no one could silence, not even the firm. News doesn't stay quiet for long inside royal walls, especially when emotions run high and rival interests are at play. Within days of Anne's emotional breakthrough, fragments of the story began surfacing in British tabloids. At first, it came as vague speculation. A senior royal reportedly intervened to stop a premature public role for Prince George. But the language used, the tone of the reports, and the sudden flurry of media interest all pointed towards something far more personal and controversial. While Buckingham Palace refused to comment, insiders started offering off-the-record confirmations. Words like protective aunt, family rift, and title drama flooded headlines. A few sharp observers made the connection to Princess Anne's well-known distaste for Camilla's elevation in public discourse. Social media picked it up quickly, with some praising Anne for defending tradition, while others speculated about growing fractures within the royal family. What had once been a private disagreement now sat under a magnifying glass for the world to interpret. Within the palace, damage control began immediately. Communications staff worked late nights, drafting statements that said very little yet seemed to confirm everything. King Charles maintained a neutral public appearance, choosing to focus on ceremonial duties rather than addressing the tension directly. Camilla, however, was noticeably absent from several planned appearances, citing personal reasons. Her absence only fueled rumors of deeper unrest. Camilla's inner circle reportedly pushed back against the narrative forming around Anne's actions. Close friends suggested she had been misrepresented, arguing she had never intended to interfere with George's upbringing and that any suggestions made were purely informal. Yet privately, Camilla was said to be hurt and blindsided by the swiftness of Anne's actions and the emotional intensity behind them. She believed she had earned her place through years of quiet resilience and felt unfairly undermined. Princess Anne, meanwhile, remained silent. She neither confirmed nor denied the reports. She simply carried on with her duties, visiting rural communities and military units with the same disciplined focus she always had. But those close to her noticed a shift. Her posture was a little more guarded, her tone a bit sharper. It was clear that the fallout had taken its toll, even if she refused to show it publicly. The royal household, already stretched thin by health concerns and the new reign's demands, struggled to manage the increasing media pressure. Courtiers debated how to refocus public attention without seeming evasive. But the truth was hard to bury. The British public, having lived through decades of royal drama, could sense when something real was unfolding beneath the polished surface. A surprising wave of public support began building for Anne. People admired her strength, her restraint, and her willingness to stand up for the next generation. Commentators began revisiting her legacy, noting how she had always served with consistency and how rarely she allowed her emotions to influence her work. Her quiet breakdown now appeared as a moment of honest humanity, one that many found deeply relatable. For Camilla, the situation was more complicated. Though many continued to support her transformation from scandal to stability, others saw her involvement in George's situation as a misstep. Even if unintended, the perception of overreach lingered. Her position remained secure by title, but her influence had taken a hit among those who still valued traditional boundaries within the family structure. Despite the growing public debate, the real consequences played out away from cameras and microphones. Relationships within the family cooled. Communication became more formal. Meetings were attended with cautious glances and measured words. What had once been informal discussion now required official memos. Trust, once eroded, proved difficult to rebuild. And yet, through it all, one truth had emerged more clearly than ever. Princess Anne's loyalty remained unshaken. She had acted not out of rivalry or resistance to change, but from a deep belief in the responsibilities they all carried. She had drawn a line where few dared to and paid the price in silence. But the final chapter had not been written. The question now was not what Anne had done, but what her actions meant for the future of the monarchy as new generations stepped forward. Princess Anne had not sought a legacy of confrontation, but history had quietly handed it to her. For decades, she had operated in the background, completing the highest number of engagements year after year with little fanfare or recognition. She had never vied for attention. Her sense of duty came from being the daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, raised on the belief that service mattered more than status. Now, her defense of that principle had reshaped how the public viewed her role. Among younger members of the royal family, Anne's actions sent a clear message. Prince William and Catherine, already cautious about their children's exposure, found renewed confidence in setting firm boundaries. Their decision to step back from a few engagements to prioritize family life was no longer seen as a soft approach. It was understood as deliberate and wise. They knew now that even within palace walls, not all influence served the same purpose. The monarchy, always evolving, found itself at a crossroads. On one side stood tradition, anchored by Anne's unwavering stance. On the other stood adaptation, represented by Camilla's journey from scandal to acceptance. Between them stood a new generation, tasked with balancing both ideals in a world that no longer accepted royal authority without scrutiny. Palace advisors began reassessing communication strategies. Rather than pushing the younger royals into early responsibility, they focused on controlled, meaningful appearances that respected privacy while maintaining visibility. Prince George was kept out of the spotlight for the rest of the year, with William and Kate quietly reinforcing their decision to let their children grow away from the pressures of the crown. Anne's influence, though subtle, was undeniable. Senior aides began involving her more directly in planning discussions, particularly those concerning family dynamics and protocol. Her reputation had shifted. No longer seen only as the hard-working royal in the shadows, she became something of an unofficial moral compass, respected for her instinct to protect, even when it went against the tide. And for George, though too young to understand the events swirling around him, something had been preserved: his innocence, his future, and the space to grow into the role he would one day inherit. Perhaps, years from now, he would learn about what had unfolded in his name. Perhaps he would come to understand the quiet strength of the woman who stood between him and a premature crown. As the royal family stepped forward, still burdened by scrutiny and change, they did so with a little more caution and a little more clarity. The crown would always be heavy, but the hands that guided it now knew the value of patience and protection. Princess Anne returned to her duties, never referencing the events again. She didn't need to. Her legacy had already been sealed. Not in ceremony or headlines, but in the future she helped secure for the boy who would one day be king. What do you think about Princess Anne's bold stand? Was it a silent act of heroism or a warning shot within the palace walls? We'd love to hear your thoughts.